Hello, curious learners, and welcome. I'm Divya Saini, your PGT history guide, and I am absolutely thrilled to have you join me for today's historical explainer. We are unlocking a pretty fantastic chapter from the past, the rise of nationalism in Europe. But hey, don't worry, we aren't just going to sit here memorizing dates and endless battles. Nope. Today, we are looking at art. We're going to explore exactly how artists in the 18th and 19th centuries took something completely invisible, the abstract idea of a nation, and somehow gave it a human face. It's a massive story about creativity, revolution, and the sheer power of imagery. So I want you to start by just asking yourself this. How do you actually go about giving a face to a nation? Really think about it. If someone commissions you to paint a king, a queen, or a military dictator, well, it's easy enough, right? They're physical human beings. You literally just paint what you see right in front of you. But how on earth do you paint an abstract idea like France or Germany? A nation isn't a person. It's a shared identity, it's lines on a map, it's a feeling. Figuring out how to visualize that whole shebang, that required absolute creative genius.
Okay, let's dive into our visual investigation for today. First, giving nations a face. Second, Soryu's utopian vision. Third, defining the allegory. Fourth, Marion and Germania. Fifth, decoding the hidden symbols. And finally, number 6, from nationalism to imperialism.
Chapter 1. Giving Nations a Face. The Artist's Dilemma. So artists in the 18th and 19th centuries were staring down a really unique dilemma. How do you make citizens feel a deep emotional connection to a country when they no longer have a singular monarch to rally behind? Well, they solved this by personifying the nation itself. They chose to represent their countries as female figures. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand that this female form didn't stand for any particular real-life woman. You couldn't just pass her on the street while buying groceries. Instead, it was a brilliant creative tool. It gave the abstract idea of the nation a concrete, relatable face that people could actually connect with. Moving on to Section 2, Soryu's utopian vision. To really see how this massive explosion of visual nationalism kicked off, we have to travel back to 1848. This was a year of literal revolutions across Europe, and we need to look at this absolute masterpiece by the French artist Frédéric Soryu. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of his dream. He visualized a world made up of what he called democratic and social republics. Just look at that incredibly long train of people. You've got men and women of all ages, all social classes, just marching together, offering homage to the Statue of Liberty as they pass right by her. Let's break down the specific details of this utopian vision, because there's a lot going on. In Soryu's world, the peoples of the earth aren't just one random messy crowd. They are purposefully grouped as distinct nations. And how do we know who is who? Visual markers. Specifically, their flags and their national costumes. And notice down in the foreground, lying scattered on the earth, are the shattered, broken remains of the symbols of absolutist institutions, like the crowns and chains of old monarchies. Leading this grand procession, already past the Statue of Liberty, are the United States and Switzerland. And that makes sense, right? Because at the time, they were already established nation-states. It is literally the perfect visual summary of European nationalist hopes. All right, Section 3, Defining the Allegory. Now, before we look closely at the specific faces given to France and Germany, we need to pause and define a crucial piece of artistic vocabulary: allegory. An allegory is when an abstract idea, like greed, envy, freedom, liberty, or in our case, a whole nation, is expressed through a person or a thing. An allegorical story or painting always has two layers. There's one literal meaning and one symbolic meaning. Think of the concept of justice, for example. Literally, it's just a painting of a blindfolded woman holding a pair of weighing scales. But symbolically, it represents the impartial, perfectly balanced nature of the law. And in the 19th century, nations themselves became these grand female allegories. Section 4, Marianne and Germania. Let's see how this builds into the allegories that defined two massive rival powers in 19th century Europe. Over in France, the allegory was christened Marianne. That was a super popular Christian name at the time, which really underlined the idea of a people's nation. She borrowed her characteristics straight from the ideas of liberty and the republic. Specifically, she wears the red cap, holds the tricolor flag, and wears the cockade. Her statues were erected right in public squares to constantly remind everyone of their unity, and they even stamped her face onto their coins. Germany, on the other hand, went with Germania, Germania is, well, she's tougher, a bit more martial. In her visual representations, she proudly wears a crown of oak leaves. Why? Because the German oak stands for heroism. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Look at this magnificent painting of Germania by artist Philipp Witt from 1848. This wasn't just a pretty picture for someone's living room. It was a deeply political statement. It was painted on a cotton banner and was actually meant to hang directly from the ceiling of the Church of St. Paul during the convening of the Frankfurt Parliament. She is the literal visual embodiment of the liberal hopes to finally unify the German-speaking people. Section 5. Decoding the hidden symbols. Okay, it's time to put on our historical detective hats, because every single attribute worn by these figures has a deep, hidden political significance. This chart here, this is essentially your 19th century decoder ring. Let's walk through it. Broken chains, that means being freed. That heavy breastplate with an eagle, it symbolizes the sheer strength of the German Empire. We already know the crown of oak leaves represents heroism. A sword indicates a readiness to fight, but, and this is a big but, an olive branch wrapped around that sword shows a willingness to make peace. The black, red, and gold tricolor flag represents the liberal nationalists of 1848, and those beautiful rays of the rising sun in the background, they signify the very hopeful beginning of a new era. So, looking back at our image, notice how these varied symbols of Germania convey incredibly complex messages all at once. You've got the strength of the eagle on the shield, the readiness of that long sword, the heroism of the oak leaves, and the broken chains of oppression. Artists use these specific items like a vocabulary to communicate complex political desires to a public that, quite frankly, was often illiterate. To put it simply, the painting was the text. But history, as we all know, is rarely just a straight line of continuous progress, right? Look at these two images side by side. On the left, we have Philipp Witt's hopeful, incredibly proud Germania from 1848. But on the right, painted just 2 short years later in 1850 by Julius Hübner, is the fallen Germania. I want to throw a question out to you. Why do you think Germania goes from standing triumphantly in the dawn of a new era to lying completely exhausted, slumped on the ground with her crown and sword just cast aside? Well, it's because the liberal unifying hopes of 1848 were ultimately crushed by the traditional conservative monarchies. The art here perfectly and kind of tragically reflects the heartbreak of the entire nation. Which brings us to our final section, number 6, from nationalism to imperialism. This heartbreak brings us to a decidedly darker turn in our story. What exactly happens when utopian dreams start to fade? Well, as our historical sources impartially note, by the last quarter of the 19th century, the unifying, beautiful idea of nationalism changed. It no longer retained that idealistic, liberal democratic sentiment that we saw spreading like wildfire in Soryu's utopian print. Instead, it became a narrow creed with very limited ends. Nationalist groups became highly intolerant of one another, ever ready to just plunge into war. The major European powers started manipulating these nationalist allegories not to celebrate freedom anymore, but to justify aggressively dominating other peoples. Take a look at this. Notice how this map celebrates the British Empire. Up at the top, you still have angels carrying the banner of freedom, but look down in the foreground. There is Britannia, the female allegory of the British nation, sitting triumphantly, literally dominating the globe. Below her, the colonies are represented not as equal nations, but through generalized images of tigers, elephants, and what they deemed primitive peoples. The allegory is no longer breaking chains of oppression, is she? No, she is holding the entire world in a tight grip. The powerful symbol of national freedom had completely transformed into a symbol of global imperial dominance. We've seen just how powerful visual symbols can be today, from Marianne's red cap of liberty all the way to Britannia's globe-conquering stance. These artists literally shaped how everyday citizens felt about their own countries. So before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. If you were an artist commissioned today, right now, to paint an allegory of your own country, what exact visual symbols would you use? Would they be symbols of unity, of strength, maybe technology or peace? Think deeply about what your canvas would say to the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this visual journey through history. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.